Well, good afternoon, and thank you for taking the time to be with me this afternoon to present this integration view of theology and the therapeutic process. My name is Zachary Custer. I'm a PhD student here at Liberty University, and I am pursuing psychology, developmental psychology specifically. I currently work as a therapist here in Florida. I work with all ages, but I do primarily work with children. And we're going to talk a little bit today about how can we implement theological concepts into psychological and therapeutic practices. So, without any further ado, let's get started. Before we really dive into a lot of this, I want to first and foremost state the purpose of this presentation. Now, the purpose of the presentation specifically is to talk about what neurodevelopmental disorders and behavioral or conduct disorders I work with specifically, and how can we implement or integrate theology into those practices. That is exactly what we're going to discuss today. But before we dive too much into those intricate details, I want to look at this kind of like Legos. I work with Legos a lot, and a lot of therapists that work with children are pretty familiar with these. Legos are, I think, pretty fun and intricate types of toys. If you look at the visual aid in front of you, you're going to have four distinct colors of Legos. The top one is representation of psychological practice. The blue one underneath it is representation of therapeutic strategies. Then you have a yellow one, which is representative of biblical concepts. And then the red and final one is theological principles. Now, they're constructed in this way for a reason, because theological principles and biblical concepts are being utilized here as a foundation for therapeutic strategies and psychological practices. Now, this is important to understand and recognize because I believe that they can be used as such in practical everyday therapy. Now, the purpose of my presentation is to demonstrate how an integrated view can complement the therapeutic techniques that we utilize in treatment plans of adolescents with very certain neurodevelopmental disorders, behavioral and conduct disorders. Now, using scripture, I'm going to identify three abstract qualities provided to mankind by our Creator and explain how incorporating those into therapy can explain the efficacy and truly influence the overall efficacy of that therapy. So I want to look at this again like the Legos. Now, Legos are very simple, but they can serve as a catalyst for complex methods, unique compositions, and overall very grand architectural masterpieces. Now, if that theory is true, then it's not only possible to integrate Christian theology and into psychological practice, but it's completely practical to do so. So if Legos use each other to form larger objects that take broader, stronger, more imaginative forms, I propose that Christianity and psychology can actually be synergists for each other to do the same. So first off, let's understand the integration view. So in general, the integration view, if you will, as described by our text, it is not something that creates if you will, it keeps psychology and Christianity separate. It doesn't oppose the viewpoints. And we need to remember that. Now, Johnson reminds us that the integration view is not a conflict of opposition. Christianity and psychology both provide valuable information on the human condition. So in other words, what I like to think of it, it's kind of like if you think of a broken down car, if you have been in a broken car, I guarantee you know that your car has been broken down. If you're not a mechanic or mechanically inclined, I would venture to say you probably cannot figure out what's wrong with the vehicle, but you could at least surmise that the vehicle is broken down. So this is much like the perspective that Christianity provides to the human condition and psychology provides to the human condition if we might not know why the vehicle is broken down, but know that it's broken down, psychology could provide reasons why the car is broken down, much like Christianity could provide reasons why the car is broken down that psychology doesn't have. So, what we have here is two viewpoints that offer differing perspectives that don't conflict, they just offer different information on the same condition. So let's further break this down. What is a perspective versus what is an argument when it comes to the integration view? Before we dive into the therapeutic techniques that I'm going to discuss, I want to make sure we understand the difference between perspective and argument. Perspective is simply different angles revealing different information. Arguments, however, are opposing viewpoints that propose opposing information. There was a movie made back in the early 2000s called Vantage Point. I loved the movie, and it was very engaging because the movie showed the same thing over and over and over again throughout the entire movie. But what it did was it did so from different vantage points from the main characters of the film. So from the security guard's perspective, it showed what happened step by step all throughout the different happenings of the show or the movie. And it did so for every main character. Most of us may remember the hit series 24. It did the exact same thing. Every episode throughout the entire season was the same thing from a different perspective. So it's not that it was showing you opposite information, but it was revealing more information that would not be revealed if we stayed with one story or one person's perspective. So we need to remember that the integration view offers different perspectives for different sides of this equation. So let's look at one more interesting concept of the integration view. If you look at the graphic in front of you, you're going to see this kind of represent a ripple effect. When integration view hits, you're going to see a ripple of separate perspectives. You're going to see facts being introduced with meanings behind those facts. And the furthest ripple out there, you're going to see it labeled personal convictions. Now, the reason behind that is because the personal convictions aspect here is because personal convictions play a very important role in integration theology. What an individual theorizes or believes as their values and holds dear to them is what proves to be most effective in what they integrate into their psychological concepts, into their therapeutic practice. So integration view relies heavily on personal convictions and what they believe needs to be instituted. That is really a core difference between the integration view and Christian psychology because it doesn't involve an overarching principled theology. It can be an individual one. So let's dive in to the key concepts. The key concepts for a need of integration involve three primary aspects here. I like to call them abstract qualities because they are truly divinely given, yet we can also give them ourselves. These are, if you will, a kenotic conundrum because they are things that God has divinely, but also qualities that we possess to give unto others. These three qualities are simply grace, mercy, and a sense of identity. You'll notice the arrows that point in opposite direction on either side. I want to very much clarify that I'm not proposing that psychology is pointing down simply because they do not depict grace, mercy, and identity. What I would like to say is that they negate a focus of it. And we'll dive into that briefly here in a second. But theology certainly edifies people in promoting grace, mercy, and identity. That's a very important concept in what we are going to discuss. And it does so in a very interesting way. Now, why psychological concepts, they don't necessarily negate grace, mercy, and identity, I have found that therapeutic concepts that deal with the specific therapeutic practices that we are going to talk about, they don't necessarily define them well. they define them loosely at best, and quite frankly, grace, mercy, and identity become subjective in most forms when it comes to the therapeutic techniques that we initiate in our child psychology. I argue that it must be natural to both give and receive grace, according to Sproul's argument, where Thomas Aquinas never completely separated nature and grace. In fact, he stated that grace more or less fulfilled nature. Grace is something that we see on a daily basis and can very much and easily be incorporated into therapy. However, I continue to argue and say that mercy and identity are more than just simply theological concepts, but they are woven into the very fabric of our beings and into the nature that is our world. We see this in mercy more so than anything else, because mercy is something that is commanded of us in Luke 6:36. It's also preached about in Matthew 5:7. It's declared as a product of spiritual maturity in Colossians 3:12, as it is indeed a fruit of the Spirit. Now, the last part of this is it's heavily exemplified through the very actions of Jesus Christ on the cross for all of us to see. So, to summarize the key concepts here, theology embraces grace, mercy, and identity. It also pushes for it. If we can integrate it into a psychology that creates pretty much a subjective idea of grace, mercy, and identity, holds it to no standard, we could encourage people to create grace, mercy for themselves and an identity to a standard that has been known to be true for so many for so long, that they indeed have grace and mercy from a loving Savior and that their identity is grounded in Jesus Christ. So if we can integrate these theological concepts into a therapeutic process that is lacking, we can enhance these therapeutic experiences. Now let's dive into the nitty gritty. My detailed area of interest. Now, I'm not going to go over every single disorder that is listed here, but it's very important to understand that when I discuss neurodevelopmental disorders, I am indeed discussing all of them as annotated in the DSM-5. Intellectual disorders, learning disorders, motor, communication, tic, and indeed autism spectrum disorder are all neurodevelopmental, but I specifically specialize in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now, last DSM-4 separated ADD from ADHD. You had attention deficit hyperactivity and attention deficit disorder. One has been engulfed into the next, which has become ADHD inattentive and ADHD combined. Now, ADHD is at the bottom of the left pyramid, simply to emphasize that this is my detailed area of interest. On the right-hand side, you have behavioral/conduct disorders. You can read those there if you would like. At the very bottom of this pyramid, you have your oppositional defiant disorder. This is characterized by disruptive behaviors and something that we like to call impulse control or lack of impulse control. That is actually the key that connects these two, which creates what we call the comorbid disorder effect. So ADHD and oppositional defiant can oftentimes be comorbid. They can exist at the same time, and this is very important to remember, and why grace, mercy, and identity can play a very, very important role in the therapeutic process for children dealing with this. Now, specific to ADHD and behavioral disorders, I'd like to look at three distinct therapeutic processes, strategies, or techniques that are used in the primary treatment for children with these disorders. Now, as we look at these, I'd like to also note what seems to be missing. What is missing when we talk about these three strategies? Now, I love the fact that all three of these strategies are what we call evidence-based treatments. Evidence-based treatments, speaking on the scientific aspect of these, are simply proven to be effective. Now, when we take the theological aspect of grace, mercy, and identity, quite frankly, I could say the same thing. Grace, mercy, and identity are also evidence based treatments that are proven effective in the lives of individuals who accept them. Now, without diving into super intricate details of each therapeutic strategy, I want to cover the basics for each. As this presentation is indeed focused on the integrative view, the results are intended to connect theological principles of grace, mercy, and identity with the psychological practices of these three therapeutic techniques. The first I would like to discuss briefly is cognitive behavioral therapy, known as CBT. The primary goals of this therapeutic approach are to broaden the client's sense of emotional awareness, to create a sense of understanding of how emotions and thoughts work together, to create actions that result in consequences. Ultimately, it will reinforce what the middle part, which we call the identity, you'll see in a visual aid momentarily, that we're often missing. We're missing a sense of personal identity, followed by grace and mercy. Secondly is dialectical behavioral therapy, also known as DBT. This is to establish an awareness of logical, emotional, and wise mindfulness that will eventually transfer to an effort into intrapersonal and interpersonal relationship skills. Once again, we will see that grace, mercy, and a sense of identity is missing from the teachings of the first step of DBT. Lastly is what we call parental interaction or parental-child interaction therapy, or PSIT. This provides psychoeducational training and functional family dynamics to understand interactions and how parental reactions influence the behaviors of their children. Once again, we were going to determine how grace, mercy, and a sense of identity are missing from these psychological concepts in therapy. Now, we're going to dive in a little bit deep to each of these views, but I'll do so rather quickly. You'll see two graphics in front of you, but notice that they are different when you look at the center block. The center block is what I call the mindset, or the identifying factor that stems or provides the catalyst for our emotions, our thoughts, our actions, and consequences. Now, what you see before you is indeed cognitive behavioral therapy. What we see in the center is what we apply to ourselves. This is the belief statement. This is what we believe in ourselves or about ourselves. The identifier is what we commonly mistaken for an identity. Now, we can fill the identifier with anything, whether it's our occupation, whether it is our status in society, and it doesn't always have to be negative. I could put my occupation. I don't consider it to be a negative thing. I love being a therapist. But if I allow my emotions and thoughts and actions and consequences to originate from my belief of myself as a therapist, it will indeed reinforce my status as a therapist, but I will find it lacking. And the reason is because as a therapist, I'm relying on a foundational identifier. My identity is different. An identity is something that doesn't change. Theologically, Ephesians 2:10 discusses our identity. It identifies us as children of God, masterpieces of the Creator God. If our emotions can originate from that identity, that spark thoughts and originate into actions and consequences, it will reinforce the very identity as a chosen child of God. What's important to understand here is that the integration of grace, mercy, or specifically here identity, into cognitive behavioral therapy, what we do is we determine that we have the ability to initiate changes not only to therapeutic practice, but changes to therapeutic resolve as a result of identifying our true identity in Christ Jesus and not having to fish around for a new identity every time we feel differently. Next, I want to look at our mindsets that are taught by dialectical behavioral therapy. Dialectical behavioral therapy, it relies primarily on dialectics. The first step of this is to look at three distinct mindsets: logic, emotion, and wisdom. When we choose to think in a certain manner, what occurs, according to DBT, is we have essentially chosen a path for an outcome. Now, logic is based on the realness of something, or the reality base. What I'd like to connect here, and I understand that this might be a stretch, but what I'd like to connect is the understanding that logic is truly what is the reality of our world. Um, for example, or for the purpose of clarity, what dialectical behavioral therapy does, and especially for the children that I treat, for most of them, when we talk about the logical mindset, what generally happens is that the person or the child that I am counseling, they determine that their actions are logically a little bit embarrassing. And that is why I think grace is a perfect theological concept to incorporate. Because logically, a lot of the things that we do initially in a situation can be embarrassing. But when we learn what grace is, which is getting something that we truly don't deserve, when we remember or understand what that is, when we consider something on a logical level, grace isn't logical. And that's the wonderful thing about incorporating it. When we don't do something logical, when we see that God grants us something that's also not logical, it's like it cancels it out. And we can accept grace freely, even though we don't deserve it and we tend to not do things logically. The second aspect of the mindset thought for DBT is emotions. Oh my Lord, emotions is something children, I, I could spend months with a child and still not develop a full idea of emotional maturity and emotional regularity. DBT teaches that when we are acting in the emotional mindset, we have a tendency to get stuck there. These are where thinking traps come in and where we get stuck reacting inappropriately. Well, emotions require us to have a sense of mercy, not only for ourselves, but for others. We can't go back in time and redo things that we've already done or do things differently. We can only change them now. So we have to be able to grant ourselves mercy. Lastly is wisdom. Now, wisdom is a hard concept to teach a child, but I love to point it out that tomatoes are indeed a fruit, but wisdom is not putting it into a fruit salad. And that's one of the best analogies that I can ever do for what indeed wisdom is. Identity is when we choose to remind ourselves of who and whose we are. Theologically, that is my definition of wisdom. Wisdom is a way that we apply ourselves, or I should say, identity is the way that we apply ourselves into being better at wisdom. Now, the last one here is the PSIT, the parent and child integration therapy. This concept, it relies heavily on four principles. It teaches praise, reflection, imitation, and description. When we integrate grace, mercy, and identity into these four principles, it's almost self-explanatory. When we learn to praise our children, we learn to provide them grace and mercy. When we learn to reflect on the actions of our children, we learn to provide them grace and mercy. When we choose to imitate the actions we want our children to do, we provide them with a sense of identity on how we would like for them to act. Lastly, when we learn how to describe correctly and more clearly the actions we want our children to do and the things we want them to do, we learn how to be more gracious and merciful to ourselves. You see, the integration concept is not just something that changes our habits, but the integration concept is something that changes our life. Through applying grace, mercy, and identity into therapeutic strategy, we have the ability to take something that is already life changing, which is the gospel of Jesus Christ, and apply it to something that is seeking to be life changing, which is psychological therapeutic approaches. I want to end with one simple concept, and that is to remind those who struggle with understanding the integration view or how to apply it. It's very simple. Just because psychological approaches do not preach, proselytize, or evangelize in their concepts and the dynamics, just because something silences theological truths, it does not mean that we have to assume that they reject them. I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to present this approach, the idea that we can indeed integrate theological principles as important as grace, mercy, and identity into simple therapeutic techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, and something as detrimental to the success of our children as parental integration training. Thank you for your time. God bless, and I look forward to our next time together.